Welcome back, everybody, to the Deep Dive. This time, we're really diving deep into the world of container security. We're cracking open Container Security by Liz Rice. I'm really excited about this one because, everybody's using containers, maybe even loving them. They're so efficient, they're fast, and they scale like crazy.
Yeah.
But how do you make sure those super efficient containers are also super secure? That's what we're here to figure out.
Yeah, what's really interesting about this whole area is container security is not like something you kind of bolt on as an afterthought. It's like really baked into how containers work right from the ground up.
Yep.
So we're talking like core Linux concepts here.
Perfect. Let's break it down.
Yeah.
For those of us who maybe aren't Linux gurus, let's start with the basics.
Yeah.
Like from the grounds up.
Okay.
We'll work our way up to the really complicated stuff.
Okay, so think of it like this. Right at the heart of it all, you've got the Linux kernel.
Right.
This is like the brain of the operating system. And, even though your containers, they feel like they're self-contained,
Right.
they're actually relying heavily on this kernel underneath.
So even though they're called containers, they're not actually completely isolated from the operating system.
That's right. And that's where the security angle comes in.
Okay.
We have to understand that relationship to kind of secure things properly.
Got it.
So one of the key concepts here is this idea of system calls.
Okay.
Have you come across this term before?
I have, but I'm sure some of our listeners haven't.
Okay.
So break it down for us.
Okay. So system calls, it's basically how applications, including ones that are running inside your containers, ask the kernel to do things for them.
So if an application wants to read a file or connect to the network, it makes a system call to the Linux kernel.
Exactly.
Got it.
Now imagine you could control exactly which system calls a container was allowed to make.
Okay.
That would be a pretty powerful security tool, wouldn't it?
It's like setting boundaries. You're saying like, hey, container, you can play with these toys, but stay away from the dangerous stuff.
Perfect analogy. That's exactly what it is.
Okay.
So by limiting those system calls, you reduce what we call the attack surface of a container. It just makes it so much harder for an attacker to do anything malicious.
Makes sense. So limiting system calls is one way to keep those containers in check. What else is important when it comes to the Linux foundation of container security?
Well, I mean, it sounds really basic, but file permissions are absolutely crucial for containers. It's classic Linux security.
Right.
But you've got to get this right.
Right.
So, think of it like you've got a VIP list for who's allowed to access certain files.
Right.
If the container isn't on the list, it can't get in.
So even though container might be running code, it doesn't automatically get access to every file on the system.
Exactly. You control the access.
Okay.
Then we've got this thing called Linux capabilities.
Yeah.
Now, these are like fine-grained permissions that go beyond just basic, root or non-root access.
Wait, so even if a container thinks it's running as root, we can still restrict what it can actually do with these capabilities?
Precisely. It's all about this principle of least privilege. You only grant the absolute minimum privileges necessary.
Smart.
Yeah.
So we've laid the groundwork with those Linux fundamentals, but how do we actually build the walls of our container? Like, how do we isolate those applications?
Okay, well, namespaces are key here.
Okay.
Think of it like we're creating virtual compartments within the operating system. So each container, it gets its own view of resources like process IDs, network interfaces, even the host name.
So each container has its own little world,
Yeah.
like a separate playpen so they can't mess with each other's toys.
Exactly. And then there's this mechanism called CRUT. Now, CRUT essentially tricks a container into thinking it has its own root directory.
Okay.
So this limits its view of the file system and further enhances that isolation.
So if a container tries to access a file outside of its CRUT jail, it hits a wall.
Precise. And then let's not forget about control groups.
Right, a CRET group.
Groups, yeah.
We touched on those before, but they're also important for security.
They are.
Those are all about resource limits,
Yeah.
right? Making sure one container doesn't hog all the CPU or memory.
Yeah, exactly. So using groups, we can set limits on how much CPU, memory, and I/O resources each container can consume.
Great.
It's a really key part of preventing one misbehaving container from impacting the whole system.
Right, like if one container goes rogue, it can't bring down the whole ship.
Exactly.
So we've got these layers of isolation, namespaces, CRUT, C groups, all working together to keep those containers separated and secure.
But what about the containers themselves? Where do they come from? And how do we make sure they're not bringing in any hidden threats?
Ah, that's where container images come in.
Right.
So they're essentially the blueprints for building a container.
Okay.
They package up the root file system, all the application code, libraries, dependencies, configuration, the whole shebang. Okay, it's like a pre-built package ready to go. You just download it and run it.
Yeah, exactly.
Simple.
But just like any software,
Right.
container images can have vulnerabilities.
Oh, okay.
So think of them like cracks in the container walls.
Uh-oh.
If an attacker finds a vulnerability, they might be able to exploit it to gain control of the container
Yeah.
and potentially even the host system.
Okay, so we can't just blindly trust any container image we download from the internet.
You're catching on quickly. It's really crucial to vet those images before you deploy them.
Okay.
And that's where vulnerability scanning comes in.
Vulnerability scan. It sounds like we're going on a bug hunt.
In a way, yeah. So we use specialized tools to scan those container images for known vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
These tools compare the software components in the image against databases of known vulnerabilities, like the National Vulnerability Database or NVD.
So it's kind of like checking a list of known criminals against a passenger manifest before a plane takes off.
Exactly. And just like with airport security, you want to catch those bad actors before they can cause any harm. But scanning is just one part of the puzzle.
Right.
We also need to harden the container itself.
Okay, so it's not just about checking for vulnerabilities in the image. It's about making the container itself more resilient to attacks.
Precisely. So one powerful technique we can use is something called CComp.
CCOM.
Yeah, it's short for Secure Computing Mode.
Okay.
And it allows you to define very specific rules about which system calls a container is allowed to make.
So even if an attacker finds a way to inject malicious code into a container, they'll be severely limited in what they can do if those actions require those forbidden system calls.
That's the idea. It's like you're putting them in a sandbox, but you're only giving them a few harmless toys to play with.
I like that analogy.
And actually, Docker has a default CComp profile that blocks a whole bunch of potentially dangerous system calls right out of the box.
I like to know a built-in safety net.
Yeah.
But wait, there's more. Right. I've also heard of things like a Parmer and Linux.
Ah, yes, a Parmer and Linux.
Are those related to CComp?
They're kind of like SecComp's older, more established siblings.
Okay.
So they're both Linux security modules, or LSMs,
Okay.
and they provide even more granular control over what a container can do.
Okay, so they're both involved in security, but how are they different from SecComp?
Okay, well, think of SecComp like setting up a perimeter fence,
Okay.
while a Parmer and Linux are like having guards patrolling inside the fence.
Okay, so double security.
Yeah, so SecComp is focused on those system calls, right?
Yeah.
But AppArmor and Linux can control access to files, directories, network resources, other system objects.
So even if an attacker manages to bypass the SecComp fence, a Parmer and Linux can still stop them from getting their hands on anything valuable.
Yeah, precisely.
It's like layered security, right?
Yeah.
Exactable lines of defense.
Yeah, and each layer provides that additional protect. But even with all of these security measures in place, there's one thing you absolutely must avoid.
Oh, what's that?
And that's the dreaded privileged flag in Docker.
Oh, that sounds ominous. What's so bad about the privilege flag?
It's like giving the keys to the kingdom to the container.
Oh, no.
Essentially, you're granting the container almost all the same privileges as the host machine.
Okay.
So you're effectively bypassing many of those security benefits we've been talking about.
So it's like disabling all the security cameras and alarms in your house.
Pretty much, unless you have a very specific reason, and it's extremely rare that you will.
Right.
You should never, ever use the privileged flag.
Duly noted. So we've locked down our containers internally. Now let's shift our focus to the outside world.
Okay.
How do containers communicate with each other and with other systems? And how do we secure those interactions?
That's where network security comes in.
Okay.
So containers, just like any other application, need to communicate over a network.
Right.
And just like any other network, there are risks involved.
So we need traffic cops for our container network.
Think of it more like city planning. We use something called network policies
Okay.
to define rules about which containers can communicate with each other and on what ports.
So we can prevent a container that's only supposed to serve web pages from talking to a database server, for example.
Exactly.
Start.
Network policies are essential for limiting what we call the blast radius of an attack.
Okay.
So if one container gets compromised, we can use those network policies to prevent it from spreading to other containers or systems.
It's like containing a fire,
Yes.
preventing it from spreading to other parts of the building.
Perfect analogy.
But what about when containers need to access sensitive information, like passwords, API keys, or other secrets that applications need to function? How do we handle that securely?
That's a great question. Secrets management is absolutely critical for container security.
Okay.
The golden rule is to never, ever embed secrets directly in container images.
Hmm.
That's like writing your passwords on a sticky note and sticking it to your monitor.
Not a good idea.
No.
So how do we get those secrets to the containers securely?
Okay, so there are a few different approaches. One common one is to use environment variables,
Good.
but those can be risky because they're visible in process lists and logs.
So not exactly top secret. What's a better way?
A more secure approach is to use volume mounts, especially those that are backed by temporary in-memory storage.
So instead of leaving the secrets lying around in plain sight, we're storing them in a secure vault and giving the container temporary access when needed.
Exactly. And a lot of container orchestration platforms like Kubernetes have built-in mechanisms for managing secrets securely.
Okay, that's good.
But even with all these precautions in place, we can't just assume that our containers are completely invulnerable.
Right.
That's why runtime protection is so important.
Runtime protection. Okay, so this is about monitoring the containers while they're actually running, looking for any signs of trouble.
Precisely. So we use specialized tools that constantly observe container behavior.
Hmm.
They're looking for anything suspicious.
Like security cameras watching those containers 24/7.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Cool.
So these tools can detect things like unexpected process executions, attempts to modify system files, unusual network activity, all sorts of things.
So if a container starts acting up, these tools can raise the alarm.
Exactly. And in some cases, they can even take automated actions to contain the threat, like killing the container or isolating it from the network.
Wow. That's like having an automated security guard
Yeah.
that can neutralize a threat before it can cause too much damage.
Exactly. And these tools are getting more sophisticated all the time, using techniques like eBPF to gain really deep visibility into system activity without impacting performance too much.
eBPF. That sounds familiar. Didn't we touch on that earlier?
We did. Remember when we were talking about Falco,
Right.
one of the leading runtime protection tools?
Yes.
And it uses eBPF to efficiently monitor system calls and other low-level events.
So it's like having a super-powered security guard that can see everything happening inside the container, even the smallest details.
Exactly. So runtime protection is an absolutely essential part of a comprehensive container security strategy.
Okay.
But it's not just about the tools and the technology, right? We also need to think about how to apply those tools effectively
Right.
and how to build a culture of security around containerized applications.
So a culture of security. So it's not just about checking boxes. It's about making security an integral part of the entire container lifecycle.
Yeah, absolutely. From the moment a developer writes that first line of code
Right.
to the deployment and ongoing operation of a containerized application, security needs to be front of mind.
It makes sense. It's not enough to just build a secure container. You have to think about security at every stage.
Exactly. And that includes things like secure coding practices, vulnerability management, secure configuration, ongoing monitoring and response, the whole 9 yards.
So it is a holistic approach,
Yeah.
encompassing people, processes, and technology.
Precisely. And it's an ongoing journey, not a destination.
Right.
The threat landscape is constantly evolving, so we need to be constantly learning, adapting, and improving our security posture.
You can't just set it and forget it. Security is a continuous process of improvement.
Exactly. And it's a shared responsibility. Everyone involved in the container ecosystem,
Yeah.
from developers to operators to security professionals.
Oh,
We all have a role to play
makes sense.
in ensuring the security of those containerized applications.
Well said. So we've covered a lot of ground here. From the Linux foundations of container security to advanced techniques like seccomp, APARMR, and Linux, to the importance of network security, secrets management, and runtime protection. It's clear that container security is a complex topic
It is. Yeah.
with many different facets, but we can maybe simplify things a bit by thinking about it in terms of a few key principles.
Right. Absolutely. Let's distill some of those key takeaways to make them easy to remember and apply.
Okay, so let's recap those key principles for our listeners. I feel like we've covered a whole cybersecurity course condensed into this deep dive.
Well, it all comes down to building a secure container, kind of inside out. So first and foremost, that principle of least privilege.
Yeah.
We've mentioned it a few times, but it really is fundamental.
Okay.
Don't give your containers any more access than they absolutely need to do their job.
Like, don't give someone a scalpel when all they need is a butter knife.
Yeah.
They're just asking for trouble.
Exactly. And next, Make image scanning a regular habit, Don't just rely on the base image. Scan the whole thing after you've added your own layers.
Okay.
Because you never know what might be lurking in those extra packages.
So it's like checking your luggage for contraband before you board a plane, even if you packed it yourself.
Now, if you've got containers that need to talk on the network, then network policies are your best friend. You set up those rules to control the flow of traffic between your containers, so that if one container gets compromised, those network policies can help prevent the spread of the attack.
Okay, so organized traffic flow just like we want on our morning commute.
And of course, never forget about secrets management. Treat those sensitive bits of information like they're made of gold, right?
Yeah?
Don't hard code them into your images. Use a proper secrets management system.
Lock those secrets in a vault where they belong. We've covered a lot, but before we wrap up, I wanted to touch on something that's been in the news lately. Software supply chain attacks. I mean, we're pulling these container images from registries all over the internet. How can we be sure they haven't been tampered with somewhere along the line?
That's a really valid concern. You definitely don't want to end up with a container that's been secretly booby-trapped. That's where techniques like image signing come in.
Yeah.
So think of it like a digital seal of authenticity, guaranteeing that the image came from a trusted source and it hasn't been tampered with.
Tamper-proof packaging for our containerized applications. I like it.
Yeah.
Are there any other safeguards against these kinds of attacks?
Well, there's also something called drift prevention. It's like, imagine a security system that could detect if someone swapped out the furniture in your house while you were away.
Okay.
Well, drift prevention tools can actually stop a container from running if it deviates from its scanned and approved state.
Wow, that's next level security.
Yeah.
It's like having a security guard who knows exactly what belongs in your house. But let's be realistic. Even with all these precautions, it's still possible that something could slip through the cracks. What happens if, despite our best efforts, an attacker does manage to breach a container?
That's why you need a solid incident response plan. It's like having a fire escape route for your containerized applications.
Right.
You need to know how to contain the damage, gather evidence, and fix the vulnerabilities that allowed the attack to happen in the first place.
So it's not just about building a fortress. It's also about having a plan for when those alarm bells start ringing.
Exactly. And actually, because containers are so ephemeral, they can actually be really helpful in incident response. If a container gets compromised, you can often just destroy it and spin up a fresh one,
Right.
wiping out any traces of the attacker.
Like hitting the reset button and starting over.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Before we let our listeners get back to their day, what are like the top 3 things they should take away from all this?
Okay. So, number 1, embrace the principle of least privilege. Give your containers only the permissions they absolutely need, nothing more.
Don't hand out those root passwords like candy. What's number 2?
Number 2, scan those images for vulnerabilities regularly.
Right.
And don't just scan the base image, scan the whole thing after you've added your layers.
Leave no stone unturned in that container image.
Then number 3, implement network policies to control the flow of traffic between your containers.
Oh.
It's like setting up traffic rules for your containerized city.
Keep those container highways flowing smoothly and securely.
If you can master those 3 things, you'll be well on your way to building a secure container environment.
Fantastic. Huge thanks to our expert for walking us through all the twists and turns of container security.
You're welcome.
And to our listeners, we hope you found this deep dive both insightful and, dare I say, entertaining.
It's been a pleasure diving deep with you both. And to our listener, remember that container security is an ongoing journey. It's not a destination. The threat landscape is always changing, so it's crucial to stay curious, keep learning, and adapt your security practices as needed. What new threats and solutions do you think will become most important in the future? Keep those questions in mind as you continue your exploration of this fascinating and ever-changing world.
Keep diving deep, folks, and we'll catch you on our next adventure.